The whispers of Zara Blackburn's barrenness traveled faster than a prairie wildfire through Jerome, Arizona territory, in 1878. They clung to her like burrs on a wool skirt as she walked down the dusty Main Street, her head held high despite the weight of the town's judgment pressing down upon her shoulders. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackburn," Postmaster Jenkins said with a curt nod, handing her the single letter that had arrived for her that week. His eyes, like everyone else's, never quite met hers fully anymore. "Thank you kindly," Zara replied softly, tucking the letter from her sister in California into her basket. At 26, she'd grown accustomed to the polite distance people kept, the conversations that stopped when she entered the mercantile, the invitations to social gatherings that had dried up like Jerome's Creek beds in August. 5 years of marriage to Thomas Blackburn, the town's former banker, had yielded no children. After his passing from influenza last winter, the whispers had grown louder. A woman with no children and no husband had little place in Jerome's social hierarchy, especially one who couldn't fulfill what many considered a woman's primary purpose. Zara continued down the boardwalk, ignoring the hushed comments from Mrs. Peterson and her sewing circle gathered on the hotel porch. The early September sun beat down mercilessly as Zara adjusted her modest bonnet, providing what little shade it could against both the heat and the scrutiny. She paused at the edge of town, gazing out at the sweeping desert landscape that surrounded Jerome. The mountains in the distance seemed to offer more kindness than the town behind her. Zara loved Arizona despite its harshness, perhaps because she recognized something of herself in its resilient beauty. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, his silhouette wavering in the heat rising from the parched earth. Zara stepped aside, expecting the rider to pass by without acknowledgement as most travelers did these days. Instead, the horse slowed as it approached, and Zara found herself looking up into the dust-streaked face of a man she'd never seen before. His features were weathered but not old, perhaps 30 or so, with eyes the color of the sky after a summer storm. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "would you happen to know if there's a doctor in this town? My horse seems to have picked up a stone." Zara noticed then the slight limp in the chestnut gelding's gait. "We have a veterinarian, though he doubles as the town's doctor when needed. His place is just past the saloon on the left." She pointed back toward town. "I'm headed that way myself, if you'd like me to show you." The stranger dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. "Much obliged. Name's Ethan Zimmerman," he said, extending a hand that bore the calluses of hard work. "Zara Blackburn," she replied, accepting his handshake with a slight surprise at the formality. Most men in these parts didn't bother with such courtesies, especially not to a woman like her. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Blackburn." "It's just Miss now," she corrected automatically, then wished she hadn't when she saw the question form in his eyes. "My apologies," he said simply, asking nothing more as they walked side by side back toward town, his horse trailing behind. Zara felt the eyes of the town upon them immediately. A stranger walking with Zara Blackburn was sure to set tongues wagging. She felt a moment of pity for this Ethan Zimmerman, who had no idea of the social blunder he was committing simply by being polite to her. "You're new to Jerome," she observed, keeping her voice low. "Just passing through," he confirmed. "Headed to Prescott with some horses for sale, but thought I'd stop here first. Seems like a decent enough place." Zara bit back the bitter laugh that threatened to escape. "It can be," was all she said, guiding him toward the weathered sign that read Dr. Samuel Wilson, Physician and Veterinary Services. Dr. Wilson emerged from his office at their approach, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose. "Mrs. Blackburn," he greeted, his tone neutral but not unkind. Samuel Wilson was one of the few in town who treated her with something approaching normalcy, perhaps because doctors understood better than most that not all of life's circumstances were within human control. "This gentleman's horse has picked up a stone," Zara explained. "Mr. Zimmerman, this is Dr. Wilson." After they'd made their introductions, Zara prepared to take her leave. "I should be going. I have errands to finish before the heat becomes unbearable." "Thank you for your assistance, Miss Blackburn," Ethan said, those storm blue eyes meeting hers directly. "You're welcome, Mr. Zimmerman. Welcome to Jerome." With a small nod, she turned away, feeling the curious stares following her retreat. 2 days later, Zara was tending to her small garden behind the modest house she'd kept after Thomas's passing when she heard a knock at her front door. Visitors were rare enough that she paused, wondering if she'd imagined it. When the knock came again, more insistent this time, she removed her gardening gloves and made her way through the house. Opening the door revealed Ethan Zimmerman standing on her porch, his hat in his hands and his horse tethered to the hitching post she rarely had occasion to use anymore. "Mr. Zimmerman," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "Is everything all right, Miss Blackburn?" he replied with a nod. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to thank you properly for your help the other day." "There's no need, nevertheless," he interrupted gently. "I brought you these." From behind his back, he produced a small bundle of wildflowers, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the dusty brown of his trail clothes. Zara stared at the offering, momentarily speechless. Such gestures had become so foreign to her that she hardly knew how to respond. "How thoughtful," she finally managed, accepting the flowers. "Would you care for some lemonade? It's fresh made." The invitation surprised even her. She'd grown so accustomed to isolation that extending hospitality felt like a forgotten language. Ethan's smile reached his eyes. "That would be mighty kind of you." She led him to the small porch at the back of the house that overlooked her garden and the sweeping desert beyond. As she poured lemonade into 2 glasses, she noticed his appreciative gaze taking in her modest flower beds and vegetable garden. "You've got quite the green thumb, Miss Blackburn. Not easy to grow things in this climate." "It gives me purpose," she said simply, handing him a glass. "And food, of course." They settled into the worn chairs, a comfortable silence falling between them as they sipped their drinks and watched a hawk circle lazily in the distance. "I noticed people in town look at you differently," Ethan said suddenly, his directness catching her off guard. "Almost as if they're afraid of catching something." Zara nearly choked on her lemonade. No one had ever addressed her situation so bluntly before. "Mr. Zimmerman, Ethan, please." She set her glass down carefully. "Ethan, then. You're very observant for someone just passing through." "I've always found it easier to see things clearly when you're not part of them," he replied. "And you didn't answer my question." "You didn't actually ask one," she pointed out, his mouth curved in a half-smile. "Fair enough. Why does Jerome seem to shun one of its prettiest residents?" The compliment flustered her almost as much as the question. "It's complicated. I've got time." Something about his steady gaze made Zara want to unburden herself, to tell someone who had no stake in the matter. "I was married for 5 years to Thomas Blackburn, the town's banker. We had no children. In a place like Jerome, a woman's worth is often measured by her ability to bear children." She looked away, focusing on a distant point on the horizon. "After Thomas died last winter, I became an uncomfortable reminder of failure." "Their failure or yours?" he asked quietly. "Does it matter? The result is the same." Zara took another sip of lemonade to ease the tightness in her throat. "A childless widow doesn't quite belong anywhere." That seems like a mighty narrow way to measure a person's value. Perhaps, but it's the way of things here. She stood suddenly, needing to change the subject. You mentioned you're selling horses in Prescott. Ethan allowed the shift in conversation, rising to his feet as well. Yes, madam. Got a small ranch outside Flagstaff. Breed quarter horses mainly, but I've got a couple of Morgans in this batch too. Is that what you do? Breed horses, among other things. Break them, train them, sell them when they're ready. It's a good life, if a solitary one at times. He set his empty glass down. Speaking of which, I should get going if I want to make it to the next town by nightfall. Zara walked him to the front of the house, aware of curtains twitching in neighboring windows. The town would certainly be talking tonight about Ethan Zimmerman calling on the Barren widow. Thank you for the lemonade, Miss Blackburn, he said, settling his hat back on his head. And the company. Thank you for the flowers, she replied, holding the small bouquet close. Safe travels to Prescott. As she watched him ride away, Zara couldn't help but feel a small pang of regret. It had been nice, if only for a brief time, to be treated as something other than a cautionary tale. The weeks passed, and Zara fell back into her routine. She tended her garden, took in mending for the few people in town who would still give her their business, and volunteered at the small orphanage on the edge of town every Thursday. The children there didn't judge her for what she lacked. They only saw what she gave freely: her time, her patience, and the small treats she baked specially for them. It was at the orphanage, almost a month after Ethan's visit, that their paths crossed again. Zara was reading to a circle of children on the front porch when the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. 2 riders approached, leading several horses behind them. Miss Bennet, called one of the children, jumping up. Horses. Miss Eleanor Bennet, the orphanage's stern but kind-hearted matron, emerged from inside. Well, I'll be, she murmured, shading her eyes against the sun. If it isn't Mr. Zimmerman right on schedule. Zara's heart gave an unexpected leap at the name. Sure enough, as the riders drew closer, she recognized Ethan's broad-shouldered silhouette. He spotted her almost immediately, a look of pleased surprise crossing his face. Miss Blackburn, he called, dismounting with that same easy grace she remembered. We meet again. The children swarmed around him and his companion, a younger man Ethan introduced as his ranch hand, Daniel. The horses they'd brought, 2 gentle mares, were apparently a donation to the orphanage, allowing the older children to learn riding and responsibility. You knew about this? Zara asked Miss Bennet quietly as they watched Ethan patiently showing a wide-eyed little girl how to offer an apple to one of the mares. Mr. Zimmerman wrote to us last month after his first visit to Jerome, Miss Bennet explained. Said he'd been looking for a good home for these 2 older mares. They're past their prime for ranch work, but perfect for teaching children. She gave Zara a knowing look. He specifically mentioned meeting you here, said any place you volunteered must be worthy of support. Warmth bloomed in Zara's chest at the thought that Ethan had remembered not only her, but also her mention of the orphanage. She hadn't even realized she'd spoken of it during their brief conversation. Later, after the initial excitement had calmed and Daniel had taken the children to the small corral to begin basic riding lessons, Ethan made his way to where Zara sat on the porch steps. This is a fine thing you're doing, she said as he settled beside her, a respectable distance between them. These children have so little. Horses have a way of teaching responsibility, patience, trust, he replied, watching the scene in the corral. All good things for any child to learn. He turned those sky-blue eyes on her. Besides, I had an ulterior motive. Oh. I was hoping I might run into you again. The simple honesty of his statement took her breath away momentarily. Mr. Zimmerman, still Ethan, I hope. Ethan, she amended, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. I'm flattered, but you should know that associating with me and Jerome isn't advantageous, he snorted softly. I've never much cared for what's advantageous. I prefer what's right. He gestured toward the children. You come here every week, giving your time freely to these children who aren't even yours. Meanwhile, the fine people of Jerome can only see what you don't have, not what you give. His jaw tightened. Forgive me for saying so, but that strikes me as backward thinking. The world can be backward, Zara said softly. Doesn't mean we have to accept it. He studied her face for a moment. I'll be in town for 2 days. Would you allow me to call on you tomorrow? Properly, I mean. Zara hesitated, torn between the longing for companionship and the knowledge that nothing good could come of it. She would remain in Jerome with its judgments long after Ethan Zimmerman rode away. As friends, he added, sensing her reluctance. I could use a friend in these parts, and I suspect you might feel the same. Put that way, how could she refuse? All right, she agreed. As friends. Ethan's visit the next day caused quite a stir in Jerome. Zara felt the eyes of her neighbors following them as they walked through town. Ethan insisting on escorting her on her errands before they returned to her home for another glass of lemonade. Over the next several months, a pattern emerged. Ethan found reasons to pass through Jerome every few weeks, horses to deliver, supplies to purchase, business in nearby towns that somehow always required a detour through their small community. Each visit included time spent with Zara, their friendship growing deeper with every conversation. Ethan told her about his ranch outside Flagstaff, the small but successful operation he'd built after years of working for others. Zara shared stories of her life before marriage, of growing up in New York before her family moved west, of her dreams of becoming a teacher that had been set aside when she married Thomas. The town's attitude toward her remained chilly, but with Ethan's regular visits, there was a subtle shift. Some of the more gossip-prone residents now whispered about impropriety rather than barrenness, which Zara found almost refreshing in its novelty. It was during an early December visit, with the first dusting of snow on the distant mountains, that Ethan finally spoke of what had been growing between them. They were sitting by the fire in Zara's small parlor, the evening chill having driven them inside earlier than usual. Ethan had brought a book of poetry and was reading aloud, his deep voice bringing the verses to life in a way Zara found mesmerizing. When he finished the poem, he closed the book and set it aside, his expression suddenly serious. Zara, he began, using her given name as he'd taken to doing in recent visits, I've been riding to Jerome far more often than any reasonable business would require. She smiled softly. I had noticed. I expect you also know why. I've had my suspicions, she admitted, her heart beating faster despite her outward calm. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. I find myself thinking about you when I'm at the ranch, wondering what you'd think of the sunset from my porch, or how your garden skills might transform the patch of dirt behind my house. He met her gaze directly. I'm not a man who believes in dancing around the truth, so I'll say it plain. I've fallen in love with you, Zara Blackburn. The words hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrifying all at once. Zara's hands trembled slightly in her lap. Ethan, she stopped, gathering her thoughts. You know what people say about me, what I cannot give a husband. I'm not asking you to give me children, he said firmly. I'm asking for your heart, your companionship. The rest is in God's hands, not ours. People will talk, people already talk. Let them. He reached across to take her hand. I've lived alone for a long time, convinced myself it was enough. Then I met a woman with the kindest heart I've ever known, who gives so much to others despite receiving so little in return. His thumb traced circles on her palm. "I don't want to leave here again without knowing if you might one day consider becoming my wife." Zara felt tears welling in her eyes. "You make it sound so simple." "Not simple," he corrected gently. "Just right." She looked down at their joined hands, allowing herself to imagine, just for a moment, a life where she wasn't defined by what she lacked. A life with Ethan, away from the whispers and judgmental glances of Jerome. "I care for you deeply," she admitted softly, "but I need time to think. This isn't just about us, it's about your future, your legacy." Ethan nodded, disappointment visible in his eyes but respect in his voice. "I understand. I'll be back through Jerome in 2 weeks' time." "Perhaps you'll have an answer then." "Perhaps I will," she agreed. After Ethan left the next morning, Zara found herself in a state of turmoil. She wandered through her house, looking at the life she'd built for herself, a life that suddenly seemed both safe and stifling. On Thursday, she went to the orphanage as usual, finding solace as always in the children's uncomplicated acceptance. As she helped 7-year-old Lucy practice her letters, Miss Bennet settled into the chair beside her. "You seem preoccupied today, Zara," the older woman observed. Zara sighed. "Is it that obvious? Only to someone who knows you well." Miss Bennet patted her hand. "Would it have anything to do with Mr. Zimmerman's recent visit?" Zara glanced around to ensure none of the children were listening. "He's asked me to consider marrying him," she confessed in a whisper. Miss Bennet's eyes widened slightly. "I see, and this troubles you, wouldn't it trouble you?" Zara countered. "He deserves a wife who can give him children, a family. Everyone knows I can't." "Do they?" Miss Bennet asked mildly. "Or do they simply know you didn't have children with Mr. Blackburn? There could be many reasons for that, not all of them having to do with you." The suggestion startled Zara. In all the years of whispers and judgment, she'd never considered that the fault might not lie with her. Thomas had been 15 years her senior, set in his ways, and while kind, had not been particularly attentive in their marital relations. "Even if that were true," Zara said, pushing the thought aside, "there's no guarantee, and Ethan should know for certain before he makes such a decision." "My dear," Miss Bennet said gently, "nothing in this life is certain. Every marriage is a leap of faith. The question is not whether you can guarantee him children, but whether you can promise to love him fully, whether blessed with offspring or not." The wisdom in those words stayed with Zara throughout the following days as she contemplated Ethan's proposal. She thought of his steady presence, his unwavering respect, the way he saw value in her that others overlooked. She thought of his ranch, which sounded like a place where she might finally belong, away from the suffocating judgment of Jerome. By the time Ethan returned 2 weeks later, Zara had made her decision. She waited for him on her front porch, a small valise packed and ready inside the house, just in case. When he dismounted and approached, hat in hand and uncertainty in his eyes, Zara stood and descended the steps to meet him halfway. "I've been thinking," she began without preamble, "about what you asked me. And," his voice was carefully neutral, though hope flickered in those blue eyes, "and I believe Miss Bennet at the orphanage is the wisest woman in Arizona territory." Confusion crossed his features. "I'm not following you, Zara." "She told me that every marriage is a leap of faith," Zara explained, taking a step closer to him. "That the question isn't what I can guarantee, but what I can promise." She took a deep breath. "I can promise to love you, Ethan Zimmerman, with my whole heart. I can promise to build a life with you, whatever form that life takes." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise over the desert. "Are you saying yes?" "I'm saying yes," she confirmed, her own smile matching his. "But I need you to understand. I understand everything I need to," he interrupted, closing the distance between them and taking her hands in his. "I love you for your heart, Zara. For your kindness, your strength, your generosity. The rest is just details. Details that matter to most people, she reminded him. I'm not most people. He squeezed her hands gently. And neither are you. With that, he leaned down and kissed her, right there on the street for all of Jerome to see. It was a gentle kiss, respectful but unashamed. And Zara found herself caring less about the gasps from across the street than about the feeling of finally being cherished for exactly who she was. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Prescott, away from the judgmental eyes of Jerome. Miss Bennet attended as Zara's witness, along with several of the older children from the orphanage who had grown fond of both Zara and Ethan. Daniel, Ethan's ranch hand, stood as his best man. The journey to Ethan's ranch outside Flagstaff took 3 days by wagon. As they crested the final hill and the property came into view, Zara felt a surge of emotion. The main house was modest but well built, with a wide porch and chimney smoke curling into the winter sky. Outbuildings dotted the landscape, and in the distance, horses grazed in fenced pastures. "Welcome home," Ethan said softly, bringing the wagon to a stop. "It's not grand, but it's perfect," Zara interrupted, squeezing his hand. And in that moment, looking at the life spread before her, a life chosen rather than endured, she truly believed it was. Spring came to northern Arizona with a burst of wildflowers and new foals in the ranch's corrals. Zara threw herself into creating a home with Ethan, establishing a vegetable garden that promised to be even more productive than her small plot in Jerome had been. The highland soil was richer, the water more plentiful, and she found herself humming as she worked the earth each morning. They fell into a comfortable rhythm together. Ethan worked with the horses during the day, occasionally traveling to neighboring towns for sales or to acquire new stock. Zara managed the household, learned to keep the ranch's books, and even began helping with some of the gentler horses, discovering an affinity for the animals she hadn't known she possessed. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch watching the sunset, talking about their day or simply enjoying the comfortable silence between them. Sometimes Ethan would read aloud from one of the books they'd brought from Jerome, his deep voice a soothing counterpoint to the night sounds of the ranch. It was during one such evening in early May that Zara decided to broach the subject they'd both been carefully avoiding. "I've been thinking," she began, setting aside her mending, "about family." Ethan looked up from his book, his expression cautious but open. "What about it? There are children at the orphanage in Jerome who need homes," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "Children like Lucy, who's so bright and eager to learn, or Samuel, who has such a way with the horses when you visit." Understanding dawned in Ethan's eyes. "You're talking about adoption." Zara nodded, suddenly nervous. "I know it's not the same as having children of our own, and perhaps it's too soon to consider such a thing, but it's not too soon," he interrupted gently. "And who's to say what makes children our own? Love does that, not blood." Hope bloomed in Zara's chest. "Then you'd consider it." "I'd more than consider it." He set his book aside and took her hand. "This ranch would benefit from children's laughter, and there's no one I'd rather raise a family with, however that family comes to us." Tears pricked at Zara's eyes. "I love you, Ethan Zimmerman." "And I love you, Zara Zimmerman," he replied, drawing her into his arms. "Every part of you exactly as you are." They wrote to Miss Bennet the very next day, inquiring about the possibility of adopting not 1 but 2 children from the orphanage. The process would take time, they knew, with paperwork and assessments to ensure the ranch was a suitable home. But for the first time, Zara allowed herself to imagine a future where she was not defined by what she lacked, but by the abundance of love she had to give. June brought unexpected news. Zara had been feeling unwell for several mornings, a persistent nausea that she initially attributed to a passing illness. When the symptoms continued, accompanied by a strange fatigue and tenderness in her breasts, she finally consented to Ethan fetching the doctor from town. Dr. Larson, a younger man than Jerome's Dr. Wilson, examined her thoroughly before sitting back with a smile that confused Zara entirely. "Mrs. Zimmerman," he said, "I believe congratulations are in order." Zara stared at him blankly. "I don't understand." "You're expecting a child," he explained gently. "I'd estimate you're about 2 months along." The room seemed to spin around her. "That's not possible," she whispered. "I was married for 5 years before and never." Dr. Larson patted her hand kindly. "The human body is a mysterious thing, Mrs. Zimmerman. Sometimes conditions change, or perhaps the issue wasn't with you at all." He began packing his bag. "Regardless, you're definitely with child now. I recommend plenty of rest, good nutrition, and avoiding any heavy lifting for the duration." After he left, Zara sat motionless on the edge of the bed, hands trembling as she placed them over her still flat stomach. A child, growing inside her. The very thing she'd been told by whispers and implications, if not by medical professionals, would never happen. When Ethan returned from seeing the doctor out, he found her in the same position, tears streaming silently down her face. "Zara," he asked, alarm in his voice as he knelt before her. "What is it?" "What did Dr. Larson say?" "I'm pregnant," she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "We're going to have a baby." Ethan's expression transformed from concern to wonder in an instant. "A baby," he repeated, as if he couldn't quite believe it either. "We're having a baby," Zara nodded, a laugh bubbling up through her tears. "Apparently so." With a whoop of joy, Ethan gathered her into his arms, lifting her off the bed and spinning her in a circle before setting her down, as if suddenly realizing he should be more careful. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't. Is that all right? Did I hurt you or the baby?" "We're fine," she assured him, still laughing through her tears. "Oh, Ethan, I never thought I always believed I know," he said softly, cradling her face in his hands. "But I always had faith, Zara. Faith in you, in us, in whatever life had in store for us." As the months passed, and Zara's body changed with the growing life inside her, they continued their correspondence with Miss Bennett about adoption. The news of Zara's pregnancy didn't change their desire to provide a home for children who needed one, if anything. It strengthened their resolve that their family could be built in multiple ways, all equally valid. By December, with Zara's confinement approaching, they received word that they had been approved to adopt 10-year-old Lucy and her 8-year-old brother Samuel. The children would come to live with them in the spring, after the baby was born and the worst of the winter weather had passed. "A ready-made family," Ethan marveled as they sat by the fire one evening, his hand resting on Zara's rounded belly. "If anyone had told me 2 years ago that I'd be a husband and father to 3 children by spring, I'd have thought them touched in the head." Zara smiled, placing her hand over his. "Life has a way of surprising us." "The best kind of surprise," he agreed, leaning over to kiss her softly. Their son, James Thomas Zimmerman, was born on a clear January morning in 1880, his lusty cries filling the ranch house as Dr. Larson announced his arrival. He had Ethan's blue eyes and a dusting of dark hair that promised to be as rich as Zara's. As she held her son for the first time, Zara felt a sense of completion unlike anything she'd ever known. Not because having a biological child somehow validated her. As a woman, she'd long since moved past that notion, but because James represented the love she and Ethan shared, a tangible reminder of the family they were building together. "He's perfect," Ethan whispered, perched on the edge of the bed as he gazed at his son with undisguised adoration. "He is," Zara agreed, then looked up at her husband with tears of joy in her eyes. "And just think, in a few months he'll have a big brother and sister to look after him." The spring thaw brought Lucy and Samuel to the ranch, their few possessions packed in small trunks, their faces a mixture of apprehension and hope as they descended from the wagon that had carried them from Jerome. Miss Bennet had accompanied them for the journey, her normally stern countenance softened by the emotion of the moment. "Children," she said, guiding them forward to where Ethan and Zara waited on the porch, baby James bundled in his mother's arms. "Meet your new family." There were adjustments, of course. Lucy, serious and protective, took time to believe that this new home was truly permanent. Samuel, more openly affectionate but easily frightened by loud noises, a legacy of the father who had abandoned them after their mother's death, needed patience and reassurance. But day by day, they settled in. Lucy discovered a love for books that matched Zara's own, the two of them often reading together in the evenings. Samuel, as they'd suspected, had a natural affinity for horses and quickly became Ethan's shadow in the stables and corrals. And baby James, with the uncomplicated acceptance of an infant, simply loved them all, gurgling happily whenever his siblings appeared in his line of sight. By midsummer, they had truly become a family, bound not by blood alone but by choice and love and the daily acts of caring for one another. News traveled as it always does. Word of Zara's miracle baby reached Jerome, carried by travelers and traders who passed through both communities. The story grew, with each telling how the Barren widow Blackburn had found love with a rancher, how she now had not just one child but three, how her garden yielded the finest vegetables in northern Arizona, and her husband's horses were sought after throughout the territory. In July, a letter arrived from Mrs. Peterson, once the leader of the sewing circle that had so openly judged Zara and Jerome. The letter was stiffly polite, offering congratulations on the birth of her son and inquiring whether Zara might consider selling some of her preserves at the annual Jerome Harvest Festival. Zara read the letter twice, a mixture of emotions washing over her. There was a petty satisfaction in knowing that those who had shunned her now sought her out, but it was overshadowed by a more profound realization. Jerome's opinion of her no longer mattered. The wounds inflicted by years of whispers and exclusion had healed, leaving scars but no lasting pain. She showed the letter to Ethan that evening after the children were in bed. "Are you going to answer?" he asked after reading it. "I think so," Zara replied, surprising herself with the answer. "Not for Mrs. Peterson's sake, but for the festival. I always enjoyed it before. Everything." Ethan studied her face. "You want to go back to Jerome, just for the festival," she clarified. "I think it would be good for the children to see it, and perhaps—" she hesitated. "Perhaps it would be good for Jerome to see us, all of us together." Ethan's slow smile showed his understanding. This wasn't about seeking validation or proving something to those who had once judged her. It was about reclaiming a piece of her past on her own terms, integrating it into the life she now cherished. "Then we'll go," he decided. "All 5 of us." The Jerome Harvest Festival fell on the last weekend of September. The Zimmerman family arrived on Friday afternoon, staying at the hotel rather than imposing on any of Zara's former neighbors. The town had changed little in the 2 years since Zara had left: the same dusty Main Street, the same storefronts, the same church steeple rising against the Arizona sky. Yet everything felt different, viewed through the lens of her new life. The sidewalks that had once seemed to shrink away from her now simply formed a path through town. The glances cast their way were curious rather than condemning, though perhaps that was due to Ethan's presence at her side, James in his arms, and Lucy and Samuel walking solemnly beside them. They encountered Dr. Wilson outside the mercantile, his spectacles still perched precariously on his nose, though his hair had grown considerably grayer. He stopped short at the sight of them, genuine pleasure spreading across his features. "Mrs. Blackburn, or rather, Mrs. Zimmerman now, I understand," he said, extending his hand first to Ethan, then to Zara. "How wonderful to see you looking so well." "Thank you, Dr. Wilson," Zara replied warmly. "May I introduce my family, my husband, Ethan Zimmerman, our son James, and our children Lucy and Samuel?" If the doctor noted the distinction in how she referred to the children, he made no comment. Instead, he bent slightly to address Lucy and Samuel directly. "I believe I treated you both for winter colds at the orphanage once or twice. You're looking much healthier now." Lucy, ever protective, merely nodded, but Samuel offered a shy smile. "We have our own horses now," he volunteered. "Mine is named Copper." "A fine name for a horse," Dr. Wilson approved. He straightened, turning back to Zara and Ethan. "You must join us for the festival dinner tomorrow night. Mrs. Wilson would be delighted to see you, Zara. She's often spoken of missing your contributions to the town's events." The invitation, so genuinely extended, touched Zara deeply. "We'd be honored," she accepted. "And I've brought preserves for the festival stalls as requested." As they continued their walk through town, more encounters followed, some awkward, some warm, most somewhere in between. Mrs. Peterson approached with forced cheerfulness that barely masked her discomfort, while the blacksmith's wife embraced Zara without reservation, cooing over baby James and declaring him the spitting image of his father. By the time they returned to the hotel for supper, Zara felt emotionally drained but strangely at peace. Jerome was no longer home. It hadn't truly been home even when she lived there, but neither was it a place of pain anymore. It was simply a town like any other, with its mix of kindness and small-mindedness, its beauty and its flaws. The festival itself was a joyous occasion. Lucy and Samuel, initially reserved among so many strangers, soon joined the other children in games and contests. Ethan proudly showed James to anyone who expressed interest, which seemed to be half the town. And Zara's preserves sold out within the first hour, her reputation as a gardener apparently having survived and even grown in her absence. The festival dinner, held in the town square under strings of lanterns as the sun set, brought the community together at long tables laden with food. The Zimmermans found themselves seated near Dr. and Mrs. Wilson, along with several other families Zara had once known well. Conversation flowed more easily than Zara had expected, particularly after Mrs. Wilson asked about their ranch, and Ethan launched into an enthusiastic description of their operation. The children, tired from a day of excitement, were unusually well behaved, though James fussed, until Zara took him from his makeshift cradle to nurse discreetly beneath a light blanket. It was during this quiet moment, as the conversations around her continued and the lantern swayed gently in the evening breeze, that Zara felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Miss Eleanor Bennet standing behind her, a rare smile softening her features. "I thought that was you," the older woman said. "I was delivering some of our orphanage crafts for the festival stalls and spotted your family from across the square." "Miss Bennet," Zara exclaimed, genuinely delighted. "Please join us if you can." As the matron settled onto the bench beside her, Zara suddenly realized that nearly every significant chapter of her life was represented at this table: her past in Jerome, her present with Ethan and their children, even the orphanage that had connected those two worlds. The fullness of it nearly overwhelmed her, Later, as they walked back to the hotel under a canopy of stars, Ethan's arm around her waist and the children walking ahead, Zara felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. "Thank you," she said softly, leaning into her husband's solid presence. "For what?" he asked, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. "For seeing me when no one else did. For loving me for who I am, not for what I could or couldn't give you." Ethan stopped walking, turning to face her fully. In the moonlight, his features were cast in silver and shadow, but his eyes held the same unwavering warmth they'd shown that first day in Jerome. "Zara Zimmerman," he said quietly, "loving you has been the easiest, most natural thing I've ever done. And the smartest," he added with a grin, nodding toward Lucy and Samuel, who had paused to wait for them, and James, who slept peacefully in Zara's arms. "Just look at what it's brought us." As they continued toward the hotel, their children falling into step beside them, Zara reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from the lonely widow shunned by Jerome to the wife and mother embraced by a love she'd never dared to imagine. The town had once defined her by what she lacked. But Ethan had seen beyond that, recognizing the generosity of heart that had always been her true nature. In doing so, he hadn't just given her a family, he'd given her the freedom to become fully herself. And in that becoming, Zara had found not just love, but a home that transcended any physical place. A home built on acceptance, on chosen family, on the daily decision to see the best in one another. As they crossed the threshold of the hotel, Lucy and Samuel racing ahead to claim their adjoining room, Zara knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, surrounded by the family that had found her, just as she had found them. The next morning, as they prepared to leave Jerome and return to their ranch, Zara took one last walk through the town while Ethan finished loading their wagon. James dozed against her shoulder as she strolled down the main street, pausing occasionally to exchange greetings with early risers. She stopped at the edge of town, at the very spot where she'd first met Ethan Zimmerman 2 years earlier. The desert stretched out before her, the mountains rising in the distance just as they always had. The view was the same, but the woman gazing upon it had been transformed, ready to go home. Ethan's voice came from behind her as he approached with the wagon, Lucy and Samuel already seated in the back among their packages. Zara turned to him with a smile, shifting James in her arms as the baby began to stir. More than ready. As they left Jerome behind, Zara didn't look back. Her future lay ahead, along the trail that would take them north to Flagstaff, to the ranch where horses grazed in green pastures and a garden flourished in the highland soil. To the home where a family built on love rather than obligation waited to write the next chapters of their story together. The town had shunned her for being barren, but Ethan had loved her for her generous heart. And in that love, she had found a fertility of spirit that no judgment could diminish, and no circumstance could constrain, a richness of life that continued to bear fruit in ways she could never have imagined.